doodle on them and.
Okay. Well, do we want to start with initial impressions? Or do we want to?
I like going around with initial impressions.
Yeah.
That's usually pretty helpful to kind of get it all out there before we rein it in. I guess my first impression of presentation, in the packet first, and then in project presentations was there wasn't a lot of variation in the three schemes. And I think I was looking for more potential arrangements, especially around the entry. I feel like the residential entry is, that stood out as an issue for me. I think it deals with a lot of these eyes on the street issues, the 24/7, this reception desk, relationship to the street and how that's dealt with. And so I was looking for sort of more potential for that. And I think especially with the tree there and what we saw as a need to activate that space adjacent to the tree, there's a lot of potential there through the residential entry, which is going to have 24/7 visibility and stuff. So that was kind of my first initial impression. Not enough variation with especially the residential entry and the arrangement of the ground floor, and then how that affects the mass of the building.
I would agree with everything Myers says. I would agree with one of your comments on the lantern. I mean, obviously, if this is about the lantern, I mean, there's two big issues here to me. One is the proximity to the single-family residential that everybody's concerned about. I'm not. That's one issue, and it fights directly with the tree. So that's one issue we need to talk about. The other thing that to go on with Myers talking about is the lantern. If we're going to make this about the lantern, it's got to be more than just the transparency or the materials around the perimeter of it, because that's really, I think, what the architects said is it's a lantern. It's open to the park. It's open to this. It activates the courtyard. There's potentially two of them. It's what's unique about it. It's what the building's designed around. But then in plan, it's nothing. What do we make of it? Well, basically the program just spills into it and nothing really happens there. So I think something needs to be done, or change the concept, because that's an opportunity there to do something significant. Maybe it means sacrificing a unit or two. So that's one. The other comment I'll make about plan, I actually like Scheme B's plan from the first floor plan perspective. I think really the parking should be below grade, just like in Scheme A. Gets a lot of that program out of the way and gets it down, and that's probably where it belongs. But
you're liking.
I like how that the arm of the open space grabs the bottom of the lantern and pulls out to the street, and actually grabs the street, and the fact that actually creates a departure because the retail is cut off is completely insignificant to me. I'd rather depart that commercial space and actually activate that courtyard and pull that courtyard into the building. So those are my initial comments.
I'll gladly dive in. Go ahead.
I'm really glad to see the tree being preserved, but I would like to see a little bit more detail about what they are proposing for the landscaping. And now that I heard the people's concern about maybe the creation of rain gardens, probably they could propose a rain garden somewhere in this area.
I think if you look at early design guidance, that's something we could recommend, but we would never see that at this point.
No, I know. Because it's EDG. Right now it's conceptual. But I would like to see that in the next step, right, going forward. Also, I think that they are applying a lot of things in their design that they are covering all the concerns of the public. The transparency they are proposing transparency on this side of the building and the back of the building by the alleyway. And that means that there would be a lot of activity, and also the transparency would provide also kind of connection from the outdoor and indoors for safety, and also the lighting provided there is going to help for the alleyway too. So My only concern also about design is that I feel that right now, because it's conceptual, we don't see exactly what's going on the walls facing to the Delridge area, considering the windows, because we're gonna have windows there, since we have apartments on all the faces. So I would like to see a little bit more about maybe modulations, because it seems like even also the public is concerned about that the building looks too plain for them. And maybe the modulation being related kind of with the design that they already have in the Delridge Library, which is the biggest building on that side of the block. You know, it's across the street.
Well, one thing I was asking myself this question, maybe this is good. If you look at page 24, maybe we'll just sort of take a look. How do we feel about, you know, modulating the building? Scheme A and B have a very different approach. If you look at the bottom row, to the way it approaches the alley compared to C, which tends to try to break it down into sort of vertical bands and makes it look more sort of townhouse-like on the backside. And I was trying to sort of decide in my own mind which do I like better, because the C seems to imply a little more residential versus an alley. So I was leaning more towards that, but I wanted to hear what everybody else thought, and it sort of addresses what you were saying.
And actually, that's what they have on the Delridge Library, on the upper floor. So I wondering maybe they could implement some kind of combination of the design, kind of related, you know, that will be part of the context too. And
The visual interest in this.
yeah, and about the alley, it's kind of tough. I know that the alley is really in bad conditions, but it would be kind of tough to force the developer to take care of the whole alley.
It's actually controlled by ESCO.
Yeah, and so.
And my guess is by the scale of the
yeah.
project, and they can correct us if I'm wrong, but chances are they're going to be required to do some degree of alley improvement. Normally, you're required to do to the center line to your
Exactly.
property and then come out.
And we cannot force the
But-
developer to take care of the whole alley anyway. I
Um,
mean,
Well, there's been development to the
It-
north and stuff, and they haven't
Can be, but
been made.
in a parallel process, the street improvement plan review, I mean, they're going to have to go through and work that out with the Seattle Department of Transportation. We can encourage them to make full alley improvements. We can suggest that that's, you know, necessary, but in the end, that's controlled by another department in their interaction with it. But
Yeah.
we can make the recommendation that they strongly improve the alley.
yeah, the alley is in
Before
really
doing that stuff.
bad shape. And
Given
And it might be something they want to do anyway.
yeah, and there is no lighting at all on that whole alley. And besides, even on Delridge, there is no lighting on the whole block. It's just one lamp. And so it's so dark on that area.
I think the key point for the alley improvement is the emergency vehicle and the loading. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like it's a very different use than what we currently see with the
The
past.
crazy thing is, if I was a neighbor, I'd want the emergency
On the
loading on the
street.
front.
On the
of
front,
building.
and that's what
I
multiple
mean,
people said.
I live on a block where there's a lot of elderly. We've been getting about 6 a year. And I mean, 2:30 in the morning, you hear the sirens, you hear the lights. If it was half a block away, that makes such a difference. And so
What
here,
is-
I guess programmatically, I'm going like, do you really want to have emergency loading on the backside by neighbors, or do you want to put it out?
Is that even
removed as
out
much
of
as
the question? There's no possibility to have,
I think you can do it on the front.
You can do it up front.
You can do it, you can,
Just
anybody
put it
can
on
go
the
get a
street.
loading zone in front of it, yeah, absolutely. And
What
I guess
about-
that's what I
what
would
about
encourage,
parking
is that you go
access?
ahead and get a loading zone.
but what about parking?
I don't,
You
you
can
can't
do
get
a
parking.
Parking access you can.
No, I
But
don't.
this could just be a pull-in.
Yeah, well, I mean, you literally just stripe a part of the curb, you paint the curb, becomes loading.
Yellow, it's loaded.
Done.
I'm in favor of that.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, and what I was also hearing about the parking is there isn't really any parking. I mean, it really is loading and, you know, I mean, it's food service.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Right.
That
That's
kind of
loading,
stuff, it's
yeah.
garbage and stuff.
Right.
People aren't using it to park in
Right.
this building.
There's only,
It's,
It's
yeah,
just
especially in
required.
this building.
If you look too, I mean,
Unless
there's
it's a
some kind of
commercial.
Yeah.
implication of loading
Yeah.
facilities on top
Yeah.
of it. And there's two ways to go with it. One is that, okay, the alley gets improved, but if you're worried about blocking, then you have a pull-out lane on the backside of the building, so the truck can kind of move onto the property and not obstruct traffic. And I think that's definitely within
Yeah.
our realm to kind of tell, basically say, you know, you're next to a narrow alley that's adjacent to people's garages, that's their only access. They need to think about how loading is going to occur in order to not block through traffic in the alley.
Well,
And that you need the ability to unload a truck and take a garbage
I
truck
think they've
simultaneously.
taken that into account to a certain extent. I mean, this could be built to
It
the
could.
property line. They're 8 feet back of the property line.
So I'm gonna hop in kind of like with my summary of the major massing issue. I mean, it's unusual to have one where there's really no massing differentiation. And this project's definitely unique in the fact that you've got 20% of the lot, which they can't even touch. I mean, normally we're going, is it an L, is it a C, are you moving this? And here from the beginning, we're kind of smashed between two competing priorities. One being the tree, which, just from my own experience, we can't do anything about. It's not even our purview. So you
Yeah.
X out that portion of the site and you go, okay, well, at least they didn't come with 3.25 FAR, because
That would just
then
be
we'd be
everything
giving,
else, yeah.
we'd have to grant essentially departures on the rear yard setback to give them the capacity. So starting with a lower program makes it a little bit easier. But the other issue that really does come up is it is a harsh zoning transition. The zoning across the alley really should have been low rise. The city should have followed its own buffering guidelines in zoning. They didn't, so they put in the 15-foot from center line buffer. Yes, that makes sense. But whenever you have an apartment building adjacent to single family, how do you deal with that transition and how do you minimize that? And you've got two mechanisms. One is you go short, you smash it out, and you come closer, and then you're trying to keep light and air above the building. The other is that you kind of pull back further and you go higher. The good news is you've now created distance from the yards, but you've also made the neighbors upset because you now have a taller building.
Yeah.
And we have this kind of competing issue there. And I guess what I'm kind of struggling with is that, you know, there's very basic plan decisions that they could have made to minimize the number of units that view the neighbors. And I'm not talking about eliminating, but just by the choice of number of units on the side of corridor and the depth of the units. You know, they have 3 that are essentially facing their courtyard, and then you end up with, you know, 7, 8, 9 that are facing the neighbors. So in some ways, I'm wondering if, you know, do we actually ask them to pull back just a little bit, encourage them to come south? I mean, it's actually, this is a commercial zone, it's a party
that's
ward
part
But
of the
zone.
question, though, isn't
they
it?
already shrunk the
They
unit size.
did, but I think what I'm actually suggesting is, you know, do you actually, I think the below grade is the way to go. So if you start with that for parking, one of the things with A and B, part of the reason why they're getting this is they're parking up there and messing the program around. I think here, if you kind of extended it more to the south, maybe got more of the units actually looking their own courtyard, controlled their own view, and then tried to minimize the number of units and maximize the distance going to single family, that within the massing schemes, it's not huge shifts that we're talking about, but you can make a couple subtle gestures within this kind of L that we're given that I think would go a long way to addressing a lot of the concerns. I also don't think you want no eyes on the alley. You need some degree looking there to improve the situation.
Well, but a complete facade, because what you have now is sort of all these ins and outs, and you've got this abandoned lot here, and so there's just, it's ripe with opportunity.
Yeah, there's no reason to necessarily create this little elbow room here. I mean, this is precious land. This is more precious than that.
I was thinking the same thing, actually. I
This is more
thought,
precious as transition.
Right, so scheme
thought-
C seems to make more sense.
I thought this was actually, kind of hurts the scheme in some way,
Yeah.
having that through. If people are concerned about safety and people hanging out in these trees,
Well, I'm
then
assuming that that's
an
gonna
easy
be-
way to-
Yeah.
Well,
But
that's the
the
reason why I
I mean,
really
the
like
throwaway
this
on,
one,
you know,
because
C
of
though,
The fence or the
yeah,
wall,
safety.
you know,
The
something.
throwaway of C is the ground plane. Right, I mean, you've got
Yeah,
essentially
this is- you
open
don't-
parking onto the alley. I mean,
Yeah,
this is the worst design
It's from the
gesture
ground,
you
in the
can make
ground
this
floor.
location.
Yeah, use the underground parking. I'm talking about the footprint up above. And what you were saying, Brandon, this respects the backyard the most. It pulls back, and you know, just a shift of
Yeah.
the corridor allows you to put the east-west units facing the courtyard and the long units facing the back. So then you minimize the number of units.
Yeah, you don't even have
Right.
to change the mask at all, you just
Move the corridor, or move the corridor.
I guess coming also back to the lantern effect, I actually think it's a really good concept for it. My fear is that the way that it's designed right now, the lantern is living rooms.
Right.
That's not a lantern, that's a fishbowl.
It's all, it's all
Like,
too.
Yeah, and it's,
It'll
you're
be some
getting
sort of
lights
a
on and off
lit
and you're not
screen or
really getting that effect. And I think both of you are really hitting it. Like, if they want to go with that concept, put the program element
Yeah.
that's gonna be lit 24 hours a day, that you can control the lighting of neighboring properties, but that you actually get activation and light and visibility
Yeah.
in the circulation,
I think
which is where it belongs if that's their concept.
There's one way to think about that lantern too, is if this is really meant to be sort of drawing people in, if that's the lantern, not the lantern, you don't really,
We never perceived it.
you're not really going to perceive that unless, you know, there is some movement through the courtyard that way. But I think it has to do a lot too with pedestrian and vehicle traffic. If people are entering this from the front, which we imagine they are as a sort of residential entry, then the idea that I'm a little troubled by the fact that you can only see the residential entry if you're moving north on this side of the sidewalk.
Which is why I like B better.
Whereas this way, you know, you sort of, yeah, exactly, and that's why I thought some of that entry program being really facing Delridge was important to, and that sort of contributes to the safety, but also contributes to that lantern effect. So yeah, that B does it pretty well for both this right on Delridge and then this actually facing Delridge. Even if it's, I don't know the tree well enough to know, you know, the branches start up.
It's pretty high.
Yeah, if
Pretty
you
well,
look
so
at
you
the
can
pictures,
see
it's actually
through.
well skirted, and this is what I was gonna say, if you had a lantern behind there, you're seeing it through the tree. I
Yeah.
mean, that tree is not hiding the building behind, it would not obscure.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, but this is a street you drive on, this is not a street you walk on, so I don't think you notice it.
Oh, the residents.
Yeah.
Well, the
Yeah.
node, yeah, I mean, the
Correct.
plan is to create a pedestrian commercial
Yeah,
corridor here.
So I was thinking more, yeah, from transit, you know, pedestrian.
there's a lot of.
And the building is gonna be much more important to the people who actually do walk by it than
Sure.
the people who drive by it. And I guess coming back to security and, you know, buildings can have huge impacts on the neighborhoods they go in. I worked on one in Lower Queen Anne where the developers were just absolutely concerned that it was gonna have this huge homeless problem. Because why? There was a homeless problem on the existing site. As soon as they dug the hole, the homeless camp actually moved. But the developers in their planning actually put sprinklers that they could turn switches on and off from the lobby to encourage them to move on.
With
10 years on,
sensors?
they've never used them. Because what happens is like, if there's an issue with the site, any new building, if designed well, actually, and I hate to say it's gonna push it somewhere else, but whatever kind of derelict behavior actually does tend to migrate on. So I think if this building is actually planned and sited and you have activity and visibility, particularly in this area, on the street
Which can be
orientation.
through
Yeah.
the area around the tree.
Absolutely. It's gonna completely change the context off the dereliction that's there right now.
Oh, absolutely.
In some ways, you address it head on. You don't say, we're gonna avoid the tree entirely with the program, but we sort of address it and say there's gonna be transparency through it, there's gonna
Yeah.
be
Well, but I also think
visibility.
the fact that it's 24-hour security and there's
Yeah.
people watching and monitoring, drug dealers and derelicts don't like that. Just go down the street.
But I think really the project focus should be that tree, that space, that, I mean, absolutely to acknowledge the concerns of the neighbors behind. I think that the more that we can take light and activity and space and put it on
Right.
the street frontage, I think the more we're gonna have.
There's a great image on page 31 that I thought really sort of spoke to what that space could feel like. I know this is more about materials and palette, but I thought,
Yeah.
it's too bad they can't do a hardscape around the tree, I understand that, but could they do a boardwalk that was raised up and actually protected the land underneath? I mean, is there opportunities there for, even if it's not directly adjacent to the tree, sort of activating that space? And then you do have a draw through, and there's a quality of that.
And I can understand saying that they can't have hardscaping, meaning concrete, permeable paving.
Pavers, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've got plenty of projects where we've been able to put things over
Pavers
tree
is to allow
roots.
the
They just
filtration
have to have
anyway.
infiltration.
And it protects the
Right.
tree too.
I can imagine wood decking or whatever you
Yeah.
see. So.
Yeah, that's why I would like to see a little bit more information about what they are proposing for the landscaping in that place, you know, because it's critical
Yeah,
for that
so-
section. Especially because it will be the gathering area for human action. But anyway, I agree with you about, guys, about screwing this part towards the west side, but, oh yeah, east. No, from the east to the west, but anyway, I was really glad to see that there was an opening to connect from the Delridge area to the alley, just because of the security that the people are concerned about, but we have to compromise in some areas. This is a page 25 for the scheme
On the
A.
north side.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
the scheme A. But,
I guess that's maybe where we might disagree. It's like, I actually think the buffer space between the building and the neighbors, to me, is actually more valuable than the open space on the south side.
but I noticed that here,
Yeah, you're talking about that.
the
Yeah,
last
like,
that they
I
are
would
across
much
the
rather see mass there.
alleyway.
and-
The last that they are across the alleyway, they have only a garage and there is an empty lot.
Yeah,
The house is really front to the side of the street on 23rd.
Yeah, they're all
actually, if
over.
you grab
Yeah,
those,
so it's not like the houses are really close to the alleyway. The houses that they are right behind the alleyway.
right?
So that's the reason why I'm really wondering the concern of the public about the height of the building, the bulkiness is, I thought that it was not really critical in this case.
But I guess here, like, I mean, if this is, granted it's Photoshop, but I mean, the distance that this is from you is gonna have more impact than height, right? Like, if this goes 20 feet further away, your perception is gonna be smaller, then you also have the ability to introduce trees or plantings or kind of natural elements that can kind of
Yeah.
help deal with the transition.
And minimizing
Whereas,
the number of
if this was
units,
3
too.
stories and comes right towards you, there's nothing. I mean, the people on the 3rd story are looking down in the yards. And I think that's one of the hard things with the guidelines is, I get what the design guidelines were trying to say when they did it, but my general belief after years of practice is they actually show the opposite of what provides the best net transition in a difficult zoning.
For that 15-foot setback.
But
Yeah,
Interesting.
like, I mean, they're getting there, but it's like, it doesn't. I mean, what actually gets you height, distance matters more than height.
But you guys are going towards the scheme B, but I noticed that the scheme A has more green areas on the alley area.
Well, that's only because of what they're doing with the garage.
Yeah,
Like, if you
exactly,
look,
because
they're
they have the
setting the
paving
building
for the
up higher
garage.
here,
Yeah.
but they're showing service grade. I hate to say it, this is the straw man scheme. They knew we were never gonna go with that.
Yeah.
Because this is basically, I mean, would we ever, this is what the design review got founded to fight, which is this row of open garages with trash
And
and
actually,
leaves blowing
next
ahead.
door is, that's how they have it,
Yeah.
the garage right here, but, that's the thing, I thought that this scheme A has more green areas than the other schemes, and that's the
So I
reason
think
why.
here you gotta look at the plate above.
Yeah, I think
Like-
this has, there's positives to this that I think are superior to both the other schemes. Without this parking solution, you take the parking solution where you go below, adapt the floor plan to it, this is a positive and so is this. With some modifications, I really like the idea of minimizing the number of units here and increasing the distance. If you do those two things.
Or maybe just
you know,
eliminating one unit here, and it's
yeah,
doing this,
That's another possibility.
you know?
But what's kind of frustrating is that, I think Brandon initially said, the schemes are very similar. You know, we don't see a scheme that says, hey, let's take the tree out even if we can. You know, we don't see one with less units either. You know, as far as I know, they're all 75 or 75 units.
Well, but I mean, from a program, if they have 75 units and that's their program, our charge is where do you put the 75 units on the site? It's not to say
Yeah.
you should build 70. No, they're actually so far below their zoning
Yeah.
right anyway. I would never tell them to cut down from their program because they've already,
They're way
they've done
below,
it.
yeah, they are.
I guess here, the one thing we'd be doing is increasing the lot coverage at grade. And not to design the
Well, you have to
building,
get in
but
the-
I mean, one
the
thing you could
departure
do,
agreement, that's also-
I guess I view, they have the amount of commercial frontage they proposed, set that as a minimum, they need to provide that, I think that meets the intent. If we cause them to go long, then grant the departure, because we're the cause, it's
Exactly,
not
that's right,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
I agree
But
with that.
what
yeah.
they could do is if they're getting to the point where they have too much space on the floor plate, I wouldn't even mind if they skipped the underground parking, but just did a single loaded parking along the north side and put more of their program area here and had program area that, you know, you have the buffer space, but you have program that's kind of
I agree with you,
through,
because that
as
gives you an
opposed
opportunity,
to
yeah.
that.
They can get away from a blank wall on that side. They
Yeah.
could actually have windows, they could have landscaping,
Well,
they could.
I don't hear, nobody's opposing this below ground parking,
Right.
even though it's
No, I'm
expensive.
just saying, if we're
It's- I
giving
mean,
them
you
too
could-
much program on the ground floor, if we're increasing the plate, they
Oh,
might not
too much,
actually have
they don't
enough use.
I got you. Well, I mean, don't any of these have units at all on the ground?
No.
No.
No,
That's actually, I think, a good thing. I mean,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
they're starting from is a good
They
point.
need to control this environment. Yeah.
I also like definitely think just viability of the commercial, you want
Yeah,
that shallow,
Yeah.
street facing, I don't think, that's
That's
not
not
really an
gonna
option.
No, no,
Yeah.
no.
But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. If we're increasing this frontage and that causes them to need the departure,
Yeah.
thumbs up.
Yeah.
Well, almost all the schemes, they have the same, these numbers have changed, but the way they describe them in the initial, they're all like.
And I'm actually
27,
with-
29 actual feet.
I think we're kind of, are we all in consensus that there is actually a benefit to having some of the primary use come through to the street frontage as opposed to being tucked
Yeah,
back?
I think so. It grabs the street rather than just hiding
Yeah.
behind it as this retail that has absolutely nothing to do with the use. But I think what really should drive this is not, the program on the main floor. It's the composition of the upper floors and how they relate to the neighbors. If they're, if it makes more sense to have an elongated arm here, I think that's what that should happen. And, figure out the program on the ground floor. I'm sure they can manage that.
I liked the comment from the public, kind of changing topic a little bit, but not totally, of promoting green roofs. Especially on the schemes where we do have roof area that's accessed, that's basically above grade, like these areas here.
Right.
Soften those up with, and of course, helps with green factor.
Yeah, I was gonna say, they're subject to green factor, so we're gonna be seeing some of that anyway.
Mhm.
But I think the infiltration portion, that actually is really important for the site. And one of the challenges is gonna be if they do have a bigger footprint, is like, how do you actually get it in? We've worked on 2 projects along Longfellow Creek, and the goal of
Yeah.
that basin is to get the water in the ground and then get the water to seep into the creek.
Does this help them out, the fact that this is all going to infiltrate?
No, because you can't really do an infiltration planner in the root zone. So what they would have to be doing is looking at that periphery. Because when you do an infiltration planner, what you're doing is you're basically doing hard detention. You're trying to find enough lot area to basically build yourself a gravel well
Yeah,
that
release.
all your water can flow into and then slowly release into the groundwater. So
But you
On
can't,
that
you
area,
can't, you
it's
can't do
not enough.
actual true infiltration as part of that.
you can, but you don't want to be digging up the roots. That's the contradiction, is normally.
It has to
the-
contain.
But can't we get credit for the fact that it infiltrates naturally?
That's.
Yeah, I mean, from a green factor, they're gonna be doing fine, but what I'm
It's
saying
from
is
the
if they were to take all kind of the roof leaders and try to get it in the ground, they're gonna be working on this periphery in order to get it in. So, and actually, looking at this, there's probably plenty of space, if this is indeed the
Yeah, because
root
you don't
ball,
want to disturb the.
they'll be able to kind of do
neighborhoods.
it around the edge if they so desire.
Or if they still have a buffer
Well,
on
the
the
problem,
side.
yeah, I mean, they've got,
That's the reason why I was
So,
glad
there's
about the scheme, because they have a little bit more green
Yeah.
area
Yeah.
here and here than the other schemes.
there are actually significant trees.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
they are
the other ones
bunch-
that,
Are they
these
significant
are
or are they
really big.
exceptional?
Well, they're neighbors, so
But they're
Are
very
they
big.
significant or are they exceptional? Significant,
they're gonna kill the
Exceptional?
trees, which I think was some
They
people's
could.
concern.
They're big.
There's a big, the tree in the middle of
Yeah.
the next lot down.
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
also fall.
right, but so you don't know the species and you don't
They look
know.
really big.
They're cedars.
Officially, I don't know anything, but yeah, it's big.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those
I
trees
guess
are-
my point is they have not been identified by the city.
Yes.
That's the,
Well, I think this was somebody's
Yeah.
objection, was the amount of trees here, just sort of what goes on.
Actually,
Well, isn't it ironic? I mean,
Yeah, it is.
it's very ironic. The entire presentation was talking about the presentation or the preservation of the tree and the significance, and they're compelled to do it because of city standards and requirements. And everybody in the neighborhoods, almost
cut it
without
down,
fail,
move
wants it out.
yeah, absolutely.
Minimize the trees. They're a problem.
I actually, I
but
would
trees are
agree with the
perfect.
neighbors on it, but it's like,
Yeah,
the
can't fight that.
city has made such a priority on urban forests that we're now pushing housing into the forest in order to preserve the urban forest.
Especially in
Kinda
this area,
contradictory.
because it used to
Yeah.
be a forest, and we have the creek, so the trees are perfect to control the runoffs.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that's gonna happen though is if we do get the buffer space back here, the infiltration's gonna have to be in the front, because otherwise you're just gonna put it in your foundation drains. It'll ruin the point. Other major stuff?
Well, I just think that in terms of materials, I mean, they really need to be encouraged to do a more significant
For
foot.
the next-
The base of the building has to be more significant. I think, they showed examples of that, the brick and, good visibility on the commercial space.
I am just wondering how it's going to look with the windows, all the fenestrations showing on the west side.
You
The
mean
west
up
facade.
in the units?
Yeah. Besides combining it in the fenestrations and the materials.
Well, I mean, obviously each unit's going to be accessible, certainly.
Because that face looks very plain, you know?
Yeah,
kinda
but
tough to
this is a
comment on.
massive.
Yeah, I know, but there's a reason why I would like to see how it's going to look with fenestrations.
Well, that's
and
what we
materials.
have recommendation meetings,
Yeah, exactly.
if we ever get there.
Yeah,
Maybe,
we'll get there.
maybe also,
An editorial comment.
But I think if you
I
look
think
at
you
like,
can move on to the list.
Let's do the
Move on
list.
to the list.
because there is no modulation being shown on the face. So,
no, but if you look at the examples,
But-
I think they show.
Yeah.
I feel pretty confident with their examples.
Yeah.
and,
As a firm, they do good work. They've got a good record. They've got a good record with this board. They've got a good record actually in that neighborhood. So I think probably the more important thing is for us to really hit the priorities. And then if there's something in the priorities that we think links to where he wants to head aesthetically, let's call it out. So I'll jump in and I'm just going to say B1 straight off, height, bulk, and scale.
which they identify.
Which they identified, but I mean, for us, we need to confirm that that's the most. And I think like if you look at height, bulk, and scale, that really does deal with two issues that we're dealing here, which is the zoning transition to the less intensive zone. And unfortunately, that element that we're supposed to modulate around, they're given kind of a narrow band around it. And I guess what I would say that we know they're in a tight spot, we know they're heading in the right direction, and that's just what they need to pay attention to.
I know that the public is really concerned about the bulkiness, but the library has exactly the same height that this building is going to have. So, in context, it's okay.
Height, bulk, and
Does the
scale is
library-
just, height,
does
bulk,
the
and scale is
library
just
look
missing that you have to do something with the bulk. We're not asking
This
to
is
like
what
cut
they're
off a
gonna-
story or do anything like that,
Yeah.
we're just saying,
Sylvia did it.
from transition, you've got these pinch points, and the one that's gonna be the most sensitive is the zoning transition, and we can't do anything about the tree. So,
Yeah, exactly.
be as sensitive as you can on the zoning transition, which is what B1's supposed to say.
Yep.
And I wouldn't go so far as to dictate what that needs to be. I'm just gonna say that that is a top priority, and we need to respond to it.
I wanted to talk about the two that they didn't identify in their priority guidelines in the package, but that was brought up by the public, and I think I agreed with even before the public mentioned it. D7, personal safety and security, D12, residential entries and transitions.
You know, residential entries and transitions is a weird one.
It's
'cause
kind
that's-
of written weird in the.
Like, if you look at that, that's often meant for like townhouses or for
It's meant-
kind of separating residential from use.
It's meant to sort of de-emphasize it, right?
Yeah,
Is that-
and I think the one that's actually more rent is probably A6. Or maybe that's not it.
Well, D12, it reads, residential projects in commercial zones, space between the residential entry and the sidewalk should provide security and privacy for residents, be visually interesting for pedestrians. So I was thinking about that.
So we're talking about the entry off of Delridge
Yeah.
that goes into the hidden lobby of this.
The actual entry.
But I guess so, when we come to that, are we saying that that's a priority, or are we actually saying we want the entry out of the street frontage? Because I'm leaning towards
Having it on
wanting
street
out of the
frontage.
street frontage for that 24-hour
I agree.
view. Are we in consensus on that?
The entry on the street side rather than the.
Yeah,
The-
there, I always hate to Frankenstein other people's plans, but they hit good parts of each of their plans and they don't have it consolidated into one. And the scheme B where they bring a
So they
sliver
component
of the
of it,
use
yeah.
forward, you can see that, like if they had their front desk here, they actually have 24-hour sight. And if you come to A, that program's coming way back around.
So this is a barrier, this hides the building. This commercial use required by the zoning code hides what's going on
Yeah,
here.
but this could be, I mean, you could do something, have that highly visible and.
Yeah,
Sure, sure, yeah.
Actually, sure,
Sure.
that's a very good point.
Yeah.
The door
Off
could,
the-
the door could be back here.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that we want
Yeah.
Yeah.
some of the,
Residents.
some portion of the residential function or
Yeah,
program
and it
with visibility.
and it goes with this
And
lantern thing.
here, the entry is actually very different than doors. Entry is actually the desk, the point of control. And what we're saying is that that point of control, the visibility of that point of control is key to, I think, to this, that point.
Yeah, and actually we can see it on the rendering, they have the transparency there.
For me, I don't want to totally, might just be me and I might be outnumbered, but I don't want to totally limit the front desk / entry to have to be on Delridge, because I think you could do that successfully back here as well.
Yeah,
And you'd still have, then view of the street and then also view of this courtyard. You'd have, basically that would be one way to monitor it as well, so.
And I guess too, I've got no issue if this is a conference room, you
Yeah,
can see
that's
through
what
it.
That's what
But
conference.
Yeah, that's what they
It's part of the
suggested.
program. It's part of the usable space that the residents use that has a street presence.
For the
So-
current color.
Right.
What I would suggest is we call it out as a priority, but actually give Michael and the applicant as much flexibility as they want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Like, we're not dictating in any way what they're going to solve. It's just,
Which one are you putting that under?
we're putting it under D12 where it doesn't belong.
D12? Yeah.
But, you know, really that also falls under D7, because what we're talking about is having the operators of the building being able to have 24-hour visibility of the street. We don't want the kind of reception desk where the person who's there 24 hours a day being out of the sight line of the right-of-way. We think that actually watching and seeing the entrance and seeing the entrance activity is key. And from a building program, emergency vehicles come. There's another benefit, like if they're pulling in front, then they'll actually have visual
There's
connection.
multiple benefits. I mean, anyone who's interested, anyone who's not a resident who wants to go to the front desk just to talk to someone needs to be able to see that too.
A5,
Oh, entrance is visible from the street, that's probably a
Yeah.
D3. Yeah.
That's
I
what
had
everybody's
A5.
concerned
Everybody
about.
has
They're a
A5.
little bit overlapping.
Yeah.
That's what everybody's concerned about.
So the next two that I'm gonna really dive into are probably C1, C2. Those were ones that I had. I mean, you know, those shouldn't even be like a choice for us. I feel like I picked them every time,
Yeah.
but I think it is because it's really critical. And here, to the applicant's credit, I mean, they actually really came with a concept that I think we all buy. They might not have carried it through yet, but to their credit, they actually did have a concept behind what they were thinking with that space.
And they identify it in their
Yeah.
guidelines as priorities as well too, so that makes you feel like
But
it's all
I think the harder part is gonna be the context versus the concept. And, you know, I'm a modernist, I'm fine with boxes. I design boxes that focus on articulation of the box. I think, you know, a very well-designed, clean, modern building can be just as much an asset as one that modulates in and out and has pitched roofs. Ironically, pitched roofs go more to height and scale than flat roof. I mean, they got an allowance in this zone that they could go up above the height limit
Yeah.
with pitches, which would go more to block views and light and air to the side. I guess I don't necessarily want to dictate where they go. I would just ask that they come back with a strong architectural concept and consistency in design, and that it takes into account the context of where it's located.
And can that context be materials as well? I mean, in terms of some of the newer projects on Delridge that I think people are pretty happy with, and some of the larger scale ones.
Yeah, I love the
Yeah.
minimum design too, but I'm just wondering how it's going to look with the fenestrations showing, you know,
Yeah.
on the face.
Well, there's kind of.
I mean, I hate to say,
other
like,
scenarios.
you can almost look at the amount of siding to glass they're implying is what you see on the side.
50/50.
They're saying that you're gonna see some windows, and you're gonna see some siding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for every project at this stage.
Yeah.
We're gonna have concerns about
In
it.
any scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in there, so.
Yeah. There weren't any others that they listed as priorities that I disagreed with, or?
yeah, well,
I
blank
think-
walls was brought up a couple times.
I hate
and
to, s-
I'm not, you know, the only blank wall I can even see in this building is maybe on the north side of the building. There's some,
But there's
depending
still
on the
units
scheme,
up there.
not a grade, but
You know.
everywhere else, there's
Well, I think
solid
if
units.
you flip this around, the B, you know, B do have to deal with sort of that ground floor of the alley.
Yeah, when, yeah, on A, when you, here, if you got a ramp here, that's blank, you know, we deal with that.
But you know, if you think about blank walls, what blank walls really is meant to deal with is blank walls against a commercial space. Like blank walls against an alley, that's actually where blank walls are supposed to go. That's where the transformer and the trash and the service is supposed to be. So then the question is, if you've got residential across the way, how do you mitigate the fact that you're gonna have some blank wall? And that's where landscaping and distance and, you know, grilling, decorative grills, you know, doing something interesting with the louvers, that I think comes into play. But I think that's another one where
I think it's pretty minor. But I think if we're favoring, obviously not the tuck under parking, but the below grade, I think there's a huge opportunity to keep that from becoming a blank wall.
Yeah.
If this is their dining area, I think they described it as the program.
Both
That's
sides.
that opportunity, bringing the green. Yeah.
So we, just from program, we can reinforce that idea that we don't necessarily have to have a blank wall. and nothing
Exactly,
else.
that's the one you're creating, somebody,
Yeah.
by switching the scheme.
And I mean, I think the other thing we can encourage too is that if program elements like a kitchen end up on an exterior wall, think about the opportunities for glass and glazing there. Because then you actually have staff that can see outside of the building, and that'll go
More
a
eyes on the
long
street.
way to help with the security issues. Other major stuff?
So, but I think that, I mean, you said to kind of address the parking and loading.
Except for, which one, D6, dumpsters and
Yeah.
utility and service area?
Well, and some off alley sort of loading.
Do we want to call that out as a priority?
I didn't see it as a priority, I thought the direction that we gave to try to get at least emergency loading
Okay.
off that alley makes sense.
Everything applies, and I think what we're supposed to do is highlight it
Highlight,
as
yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
Yeah.
call out. The worst thing we could do is tell them everything, and then they don't.
But I think that, you know, the neighbors immediately behind are obviously concerned that
Yeah.
if there's loading happening in the morning when they're trying to, you know, if there's not an accommodation, they can't get out of the garage or, you know.
But so I guess in that case, it seems the priority of a loading strip off alley to ensure traffic coming through is actually probably more important
Yeah.
than,
The emergency.
or
Or
the screening or whatever that we
Yeah.
would do. I mean, like having some ability to get trucks out.
The last one I would put in there is E3. And this started all about the tree. Let's do something around the tree that makes sense rather than just leave it as a
Yep.
meadow.
Special site
That's-
condition, yeah.
Yeah, I was
That's critical here.
wavering between E2 and E3
Yeah.
as to what came out, with what hits that best.
Yeah.
They named
I think
both,
it's-
they named both in their proposals, so.
Yeah.
I mean, that soil underneath that tree's hard as a rock. And it needs it to breathe, so it's gonna be a tough space to landscape.
Okay. How are we feeling?
Right, it's a good project.
I mean, there's always, like to see more variation in the options, but it's not enough for me to say, go start from the drawing board, so, pretty happy with, like we said, there's very exciting things about each of the schemes that we could combine and see into something really tough.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is it's a more intensive zone up against a single-family residential zone, and there are impacts, and we all know that. And the zoning code is set up to deal with that. They've actually met all those things. We're asking them to expand on that.
So, sounds like consensus is to let them go ahead and approve, or submit for master use permit, the past design review, or early design guidance. Summary, do you want me to
Sure,
hit it?
that'd be great.
Okay, so I know we've talked about a lot more things, but I think I'll probably just talk to the couple major ones. I think the highest priority for us as a board are A3, A5, B1, C1, C2, D7, D12, and E2 and E3. I think in general, we understand that they're in a constrained site, that they're coming in with a smaller program, but the biggest challenge is going to be how to address the zoning transition to the east of the property. With that, we would encourage them to explore options that push the building towards the south property line in favor of a greater buffer on the east side, that some use of trees or other kinds of screening issues would be encouraged in that area to deal with the privacy concerns to the single-family houses to the east. That said, we're not asking for grand gestures. We think they're heading that way. We're just encouraging them to continue to head that way. I think we all appreciate the lantern concept. If they're going to come forward with that concept, we encourage them to fully embrace it and try to get circulation spaces into the lanterns so that they can really fully execute what they came with. We feel that they're heading a solid direction. Do it. Get across the goal line with it. Retail, we acknowledge the neighbors' concern that they get a true mixed-use building that's beyond just this program, that they get something that becomes an asset to the neighborhood. I think the minimum amount of space we would like to see is about what they have in, say, Scheme A. And we know that we're pushing in some portion of the building use into that area. Obviously, we would grant the departure for what we as a board are causing. We're creating a worse situation for them in terms of the code than what they came to us with. So we would be obviously willing to grant that departure because that's something that's getting driven off our motivation as opposed to theirs.
We're talking about parking.
I think parking, they're doing it from the right location, meaning from the alley. And I think we'll leave it up to them whether they want to do it enclosed or like a single trunk. But we absolutely do not want to see covered, exposed stalls facing the alley. That parking needs to be contained and controlled. And that's their responsibility, I think, in terms of D7 for safety. That at this location, we do not want to see unenclosed, unsecured parking. Whether it's at grade, tucked in the northeast corner of the site, or below grade, totally up to them based on their expense and their performa and their final design. Loading and alley improvements, the board strongly encourages full alley improvements. We know it's not our purview, but given what the neighborhood's being asked to take, we would encourage the DPD to work with SDOT and the applicant to do whatever they can to improve the condition on the alley. That's purely a suggestion on our part, and we have no purview over it, but we will concur with the neighbor's request. We think for what the immediate neighbors are taking on, that's kind of a pretty minimal ask. Safety and security is past B1, I think our next top concern. Not having units at ground level, having the 24-hour management, eyes on the street, taking responsibility for their own program and trying to become an asset to the neighborhood as opposed to potential detriment, I think are all key concerns of the board. Am I missing anything major? Oh, infiltration gardens.
Landscaping.
Landscaping. We want to see full landscape plans. We will not grant green factor departures because we as a board don't grant green factor departures unless you're in a low-rise zone. But
I'd like to see maybe using landscaping to activate the space around the tree, if where possible. Just, the current description shows that it could be planted, but doesn't really enhance, it doesn't really address the concerns that is just a darker space that is somewhat hidden from view.
well, you can occupy space beneath the tree. And I think if they can get some kind of permeable paving over some percentage of the roots so that you're actually getting open space that's inhabitable and usable by the residents would be
It's the new smoking garden.
That's right.
You know?
That's what it did.
Knowing people from SMR, I know that actually comes up in their projects. So, okay, with that,
Okay.
good luck, guys. You've got a challenging site, but hopefully we didn't mess up your lives too badly.